All right, school is in session. So take your seats and turn up the volume. It's time for the smartest fishing show on the internet. This is the show that dives into everything fishing, from tactics and gear to policy and product. Here he is, the fishing professor, Professor Sid Dobrin. So stick around, you might learn something.
Bark, 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 bark.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that was Lead Chicken, one of the greatest heavy poultry bands of all time. But I'm not here to chicken out, because this is the Inventive Fishing Professor Rodcast, and I am Sid Dobrin, the fishing professor, and I'm here to cluck about fishing. And this week we have got a great show lined up, because we're going to have a great conversation with Mr. Whit Fosburgh, the president and CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. We'll also take a bourbon break today, and I'll pour a few drams of Slaughterhouse American whiskey and give you my thoughts about it. I'm also going to count down my top 10 lures for targeting king mackerel, because there is nothing like a smoker king burning line from your reel. And even though this is the Rodcast, we do like to keep it real, or at least keep it on the reel. Really, we do. So let's put it in the rod holder, sit back in the captain's chair, drop down to idle speed, and troll up some trophies. Hey, welcome to the Rodcast. Let's get cast. Welcome, welcome, my listening crew. I am honored today to have Mr. Whit Fosburgh joining us on the Rodcast. Now, Mr. Fosburgh is the president and CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, or TRCP for short. And TRCP is a nonprofit coalition of conservation organizations, grassroots partners, and outdoor-related businesses, the main goal of which is to encourage increased federal funding for conservation while preserving access for hunters and anglers. In fact, TRCP makes it pretty clear that their mission is, and this is a quote, to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish. Mr. Fosburgh sits at the helm of this important organization. And prior to joining TRCP in 2010, he spent 15 years at Trout Unlimited, playing a critical role in the organization's evolution into a conservation powerhouse. Additionally, he served as fisheries director for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, was the chief environment and energy staff member for Senator Tom Daschle, and was a wildlife specialist for the National Audubon Society. And in 2015, he was honored as the Conservation Partner of the Year by Bass Pro Shops. Now, Fosburgh grew up hunting and fishing in upstate New York and was a member of Team USA in the 1997 World Fly Fishing Championships. He's got a BA in government from Georgetown and a master's from Yale and the School of Forestry. He's also coached crew at the collegiate level for 15 years. Mr. Fosburgh, I cannot thank you enough for all of your work over the years to protect both the places where Americans hunt and fish and our rights to be able to hunt and fish. Thank you so much for joining me on the Rodcast.
Sid, it's great to be here, and obviously it's something I love to do too, so it doesn't really seem like work.
Oh, excellent. Then we'll have some fun today. It's those opportunities where you get to have fun talking about fisheries policy. So
let's bring it on.
All right. Well, so on the Rodcast, I like to kick things off with some origin story conversation. Could you tell us first a little bit how you got introduced to fishing and hunting, and then about how the passions you developed for fishing and hunting in the outdoors came to steer your career trajectory?
Sure. I grew up in the woods of upstate New York. My dad worked for the conservation department. We had a woodlot, including a trout stream that ran through it. We had no neighbors. And so my brother and I were the original free-range children who would sort of go outside and play in the woods and in the stream. And basically had a fly rod in hand by the time we were walking. And usually that had a worm on the end of it. And we knew every little pool in that trout stream, and probably had poked every brook trout, over 6 inches in that stream as well. So it was really part of growing up. And then, I got involved with conservation policy when I went to Georgetown undergrad. I was a government major and got to the end of 4 years and still felt I knew more about wildlife and forestry and fisheries than I did about world geopolitics. So got my first job out of college with the National Audubon Society, and just continued to evolve that over time, but always within that realm of environmental policy, hunting and fishing, fish and wildlife. And, my brother had the same addiction. He now works for the Park Service out of Boston, runs their Northeast Rivers program, doing wild and scenic river conservation and working with communities on their riverfront corridors, throughout that part of the world. So we both tend to go back to our camp in the Adirondacks and fish with our families in the summer. And then, obviously I can use the excuse of getting away with a donor or with a partner group and hit the water around here or pretty much any place from time to time. So I enjoy it very much.
Oh, that's fantastic. What a great story, and what a great way to end up doing what you're doing. So with that in mind, could you tell our listening crew a bit about what TRCP does? I think for a lot of anglers, TRCP is certainly visible. I mean, we all see that sign in every Bass Pro Shop honoring TRCP's conservation efforts. But I think that anglers and hunters would like to know more about what TRCP does.
So the brainchild, TRCP was the brainchild of a guy named Jim Range. And Jim had been the chief counsel for Howard Baker when Baker was majority leader of the Senate back in the 80s under the Reagan administration. They're both from rural Tennessee, both loved to hunt and fish, and was very much sort of an old school Republican conservationist. And he'd get lobbied by all these groups on their pet little issues, be it, trout or grouse or pheasants or ASA or whatever. And he became frustrated with the fact that he felt that the community was winning little battles and losing big wars by not working together properly. And so in 2002, he created this organization to bring all the groups that cared about conservation together to speak in a common voice on issues that were too big for any one group. That could be public land policy, energy policy, marine fisheries policy, water policy, you name it. And today, Jim suddenly passed away in 2009 from kidney cancer. I came in 2010 and have continued his original vision. So today we have 62 different organizations under the broad TRCP umbrella. Not a trade association, nobody pays dues. All we ask is that they roll up their sleeves and work together in a common interest on shared issues. So things like the Modern Fish Act would fall under that category. More recently, a lot of the infrastructure bill or the climate bill would fall under that. The Farm Bill, which is coming up next year. We have 25 groups in our Wildlife and Agriculture Working Group, and they come together, hammer out a collective policy on Farm Bill. And then part of our job is to make sure that we all stay in line and don't break off and cut side deals. So far been pretty good. I think our track record speaks for itself.
That's excellent. Yeah, and there's no doubt that you all have been doing amazing things. So Theodore Roosevelt, last year you wrote a blog post about Roosevelt's legacy and its relevance to conservation. I was wondering if you might tell us a bit about the influence of Theodore Roosevelt on American conservation approaches and why his work is still important.
I mean, really, you can go back to his time in the 1880s, and it was Roosevelt that helped create the modern conservation system. He found the Boone and Crockett Club at that time to end the market hunting he was seeing out west, which was really the first of the modern conservation organizations. And, when he was president, even before he was president, when his wife and his mother died on the same day, Valentine's Day, he went out to North Dakota and became a cowboy and basically retreated from public life for a couple of years. And he really credits that with what made him the man that he became. And he thought that every American ought to have that same opportunity to go out and test themselves in the wild. And he envisioned a conservation system in this country that was very different than what you would experience in Europe, where it was the landed gentry that owned the fish and wildlife, and hunting and fishing were sports of the rich and the elite. And here he thought it was something that every American, regardless of class, wealth, status, race, ought to be able to do. And so we've developed that conservation system in a very different way than had been done in Europe. And while he was president, he set aside 230 million acres for all Americans to enjoy, to get outside, to chase critters if they wanted to, or just to be in the wild. And it's, then the sporting community at that time, really created the early environmental laws, from, stopping the market hunting to the first conservation laws to the public land laws. And you think back in those times, and it was, the groups of that era were groups like the Wildlife Society, the National Wildlife Federation, the Isaac Walton League, groups that didn't have any one critter focus. They didn't have any one gear, any one species, any one geography. I mean, they cared about conservation broadly. And it was really in the beginning of the 1930s when Ducks Unlimited was created that began to change. And groups like DU and then TU in the 50s, the Turkey Federation, Pheasants Forever, you name it today, there is a group out there that has, done remarkable things of bringing back at-risk species. Now, the downside of all that good work was that loss of collective vision on federal policy, and that's where TRCP comes in.
That's excellent. And Roosevelt's just such a great figure to have initiated not just those conversations, but also to be the inspiration for TRCP. I do want to note that recently on the TRCP blog that Liz Ogilvie had this great post about Roosevelt's church in D.C. being up for sale and the role it might be able to play in future conservation work as well, which is a great way to just maintain that legacy as well. Yeah,
it's neat. I mean, he would walk up the 6 blocks from the White House to this church and, Grace Reformed Church, and was very involved. He laid the cornerstone of the church. He was, if he couldn't make a sermon or a service on Sunday, he would write a letter to the pastor saying he was not going to be there. And it's a cool place. And the folks that are running it now, the man and the woman that, basically run the pastor and his wife, and, Liz interviewed Jessica, the wife, have just a great vision. I mean, it's not only just, restoring a cool building and recognizing Roosevelt, but also using it as a gathering place for conservation. And so, listen, we're going to help them how we can. We'll put the word out about it. We'll encourage folks to donate to it. We're doing a meeting at the board meeting this summer is going to be at the Theodore Roosevelt Library in North Dakota that is soon to begin construction. So he'll have his own presidential library out in Medora, where he spent those years recovering from the losses of his family and where he became a man, in his words.
Oh, that's fantastic. Love to see that legacy kept alive in those ways. All right. So Roosevelt aside, I want to get you to talk about something that's been very important to me in my own work, something that really drove me to write my book, Fishing Gone, Saving the Ocean Through Sport Fishing. And that's the ways in which the revisions to the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the development of the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act unfolded. And TRCP had a big hand in this legislative unfolding. And in 2014, TRCP organized the Commission on Saltwater Recreational Fisheries Management, which is more commonly known as the Morris Deal Commission, referring to the leadership of Johnny Morris, CEO of Bass Pro, and Scott Deal, president of Maverick Boats. Now, the commission was an expert panel of state and federal agency administrators, researchers, industry representatives, and economists who worked to promote a proactive vision for saltwater fisheries management. Could you talk about TRCP's role in the Morris Deal Commission and both the importance of what the commission published in that report, A Vision for Managing America's Saltwater Recreational Fisheries, that then ultimately was picked up as the foundation for the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act?
Yeah, so when I came to TRCP, I mean, I was not seeped in, saltwater fish policy at all. I mean, I spent 15 years dealing with, terrestrial fish policy and particularly cold water fish policy when I was at Trout Unlimited. But it became pretty clear that, there was all this acrimony, and you had the environmental community fighting with the recreational fishing community in places like, California, with the Marine Life Protection Act, which excluded recreational fishing from large parts of the coast. And we had, fights of red snapper in the Gulf going on. And it was just, it was a mess. And, in my mind, recreational fishermen had always been fundamental to conservation. And the notion that we were at odds with the environmental community, which had made this essentially deal with the devil with the commercial fishing organizations, just seemed, insane. And one day, Mike Nussman, who at that time was running American Sport Fishing Association, and Bob Hayes, who was then the, I think, general counsel emeritus at Coastal Conservation Association, invited me down to lunch in Alexandria. And I went down there, and they basically said, okay, our community is really good at saying what it doesn't like. It doesn't like marine protected areas. It doesn't like, federal control. It doesn't like this. We have a much harder time saying what we're in favor of. And we need to get the community together with a proactive, positive vision based around conservation and access. And so they pitched the idea of us organizing and then running the Morris Deal Commission, which eventually did lead to the Modern Fish Act, but essentially as a way to get the community from down on its haunches in a defensive position to moving forward with a positive conservation access-based vision for where we go forward. Because, the notion that we were still managing recreational fisheries under commercial fishing paradigm is crazy. I mean, the goals are the exact opposite. In commercial fishing, your goal is to kill as many fish as efficiently as possible. Recreational fishing, the goal is to catch as few fish as possible and have a great time and spend a bunch of money doing it. And as Nussman would like to point out, most recreational anglers are really bad. And they need a whole lot of fish in the ocean to be successful. And that's certainly the case with me and a lot of others I know. And, so conservation should go hand in hand with that. So we did this year-long process where we brought together this blue ribbon panel. We had the key staff members from the various sport fishing groups who basically staffed this and had a facilitator, and then released the report, and then did a media and political outreach in DC with Johnny Morris, with Larry McKinney at Hart down in Texas and others, really explaining this to lawmakers. At that time, there was very little appetite for opening up the Magnuson Act because the environmental community was pretty happy with it and the commercial guys were pretty happy with it. The only people who were complaining were the recreational community. So we crafted the Modern Fish Act, which then ended up passing the standalone bill without opening up Magnuson per se. And while there was a lot of discretion in how that was done, it finally gave the green light to NOAA and National Marine Fisheries to start managing recreational fisheries in a fundamentally different way. And they've begun doing that. And part of that was just come out with a recreational fishing policy. Until then, as NOAA had never had a recreational fishing policy. And they had done plenty of things on the commercial side, but they treated the recreational guys as very much second-class citizens. And so the one thing that didn't get done in that bill that we need to work on is the forage base. And so we had several recommendations that were top line in terms of just alternative management and things like that. But the one thing we didn't get in Modern Fish Act was forage fish. So now really ASA and Mike Leonard have crafted a forage fish conservation act that is pending in Congress right now. And if we can get that passed either with the Magnuson Act reauthorization or more likely as a standalone bill, then I'd say we can pat ourselves on the back for a job pretty well done. There are always going to be fights at the council level or at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission or bodies like that. But at least the deck won't be stacked against us.
I want to come back in a minute to the Forage Fish Conservation Act, particularly given some of the stuff you've already written about that. But I want to stick with the Morris Deal Commission for a moment. So when Eileen Sobek, who was the NOAA Marine Fisheries Administrator, introduced the A Vision for Managing America's Saltwater Recreational Fisheries report at the Miami International Boat Show in February of 2015, the report identifies 6 guiding principles. Now, I'm not going to go through all 6 of these principles, though they're all important, but I want to ask about your thoughts about one of the guiding principles, because I think it really tells us a lot about contemporary thinking about conservation. And that's the principle that recreational fishing policy needs to provide scientifically sound and trusted social, cultural, economic, and ecological information. Really, this is one of the first times we've seen the importance of the social and the cultural emphasized as on par with the economic and the ecological approaches to policy. Could you talk a bit about why this cultural focus became part of the guiding principles for this?
Yeah, and again, I wasn't in NOAA when they released this, but I think we had some influence on it. And I think we can go toe-to-toe with the commercial side in terms of economics, and I think all the data shows that. And in general, there is greater economic impact from recreational fishing than commercial fishing. If you look at all the, everything from marinas to boat sales to fishing tackle to you name it. But, that really misses it. I mean, because, there is something far more fundamental to getting out there on a weekend with your kid and having that experience, the same way Roosevelt did in the Dakotas. And, that is something that's really hard to quantify. And we always, see the commercial side as like, these larger-than-life characters that we need to preserve that cultural lifestyle. Well, listen, it's the same thing on the recreational side. It looks a little bit different, but I mean, how important it is to get out there and basically those experiences you had that helped shape you, and that's true with all of us. I mean, if it wasn't, when I was in grad school in Connecticut, I was wading the flats in Long Island Sound trying to find striped bass with my fly rod, and we found a few, but there weren't many striped bass back in those days. I mean, those experiences were fundamental to the work I'm doing today. And, that's hard to quantify economically.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think you also hit on a key point there. I think, at least from my reading of the situation, I think the fact that the recreational side of things began to be able to show the economic influence on par, if not more than the industrial side of things, also got NOAA's attention in a big way.
Big time. No question about that one. And but again, to their credit, they recognize that it's more than just dollars and cents too, that there are a ton of people out there using this resource and respecting it. And those are the future guardians of that conservation that you and I and so many millions of others are today. And without that experience, they're not going to be there.
Right. Absolutely. So you've also been a big proponent of conservation policies needing to be based in science. And I think you wrote a piece for the Orlando Sentinel a while back about why science needed to be the influencing factor in making policy decisions about Florida black bear conservation rather than relying on emotions and politics. And of course, you were writing about the black bear situation in Florida, but your underlying philosophies are much more expansive than being applicable to one context. That's a tough demarcation to make these days between science and emotion and politics. Can you talk about how we keep focused on the science in conservation matters?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And I remember generally the piece. I don't remember what my argument was in general, but what we're seeing more and more today is wildlife management being taken out of the hands of the professionals, the scientists, the folks who've trained in this stuff, and instead legislatures making decisions. And you see it on the left and you see it on the right. You see it from banning bear hunting in New Jersey and places like that to bounties on wolves in Montana and Idaho. I mean, both sides have a lot to be ashamed of. And what we need to do is to get back into that sensible center, where we may not agree with it, but the science is supporting that, the professionals are doing it, and as users, we need to accept that and agree with it. And listen, if we come up with better science and say that they're wrong, great. But let's keep this out of the hands of the politicians and in the hands of the professionals that we pay good money to run this stuff and to know this stuff.
I think that was also a big key point in the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act, was that emphasis on there needs to be science, there needs to be data, and then actually setting parameters for how that science needs to be gathered and what organizations are supposed to do with that science.
Yeah, and you think about, you get a mail survey months after you fished asking what you caught and where you caught them. I mean, that is not 2022 technology. And, I think folks like, I just got back from deer camp last week and got a nice buck and reported that. I mean, folks are used to doing, they did all on my phone, and folks are used to doing that now. So the notion that, we're going to abide by this sort of arcane old system that we've used for a long time that doesn't work particularly well, whereas we can get the anglers engaged. You don't have to give up your honey hole, but you can report what you're catching. And, the agency is going to be much more real-time data. And that's always been the knock against the recreational side, is they're unaccountable because you don't have, a handful of ports where you can count all the fish that are coming in like you do on the commercial side. Every place you have a dock and somebody can roll a boat into the water, you potentially have another place where you have an unaccountable angler, or so NOAA would say. And I think you're finally starting to see the states use the fishermen and the recreational anglers and modern technologies to get way better data than we've had in the past. But it's still slow to get the federal agencies to accept that. And I agree that you can cook data in a bunch of different ways, but the notion that we're using these old surveys, either telephone calls or mail surveys, that's just not the way the world works anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a data science perspective, surveys just don't produce the kinds of information you really want. But I think also in what you're saying, there's also a big moment for citizen science here too. And I think that that red snapper had become one of the touch points for this, that the observations that anglers, both industrial, commercial, and recreationals, are making is providing a lot of the data that's just not being looked at by the feds in a way that we're providing accurate information.
No, I mean, you hear all the anecdotal accounts, and again, they're anecdotal, but there are red snapper everywhere. And that seems to be a pretty darn well managed fishery right now, and not one that needs to be reined back in. And listen, I'm all for if you have a species that's in trouble or a stock that's in trouble, like we do with striped bass. And we took our medicine this past year and cut way back on harvest on the Atlantic, and the initial results are pretty positive. That stock is all of a sudden starting to move back up again. So it's much better to take that medicine where you need to. But if you're using sort of outdated stock assessments, and you're counter to what everybody is thinking, and you're part of the way we have a striped bass is that recreational anglers up and down the coast were telling you the numbers were down. And so it's not like we're Pollyannic. Like, if people are telling you across the Gulf that red snapper seem to be doing great, and you can't get a fish up without a red snapper hitting it, then there's probably something to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned something about when we were talking about both Magnus and Stevens, and also the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act. You talked about briefly about the legislative approaches here, which kind of begs a question too, or something that I'm interested in. And I don't know if it's begging a question or a comment. That interestingly, a lot of conservation-focused legislation, more often than not, the conservation measures seem to be approached more from bipartisan support more than any other types of legislative efforts. We saw that particularly in the passing of the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act. Why do you suppose that conservation efforts are more bipartisan, even though there is all this emotional investment and capital investment?
Well, I think that's been, intentional. It's fundamental of what we're trying to do. I mean, there's a lot to disagree about in Washington, D.C. Hunting, fishing, conservation should be not among those. I mean, it doesn't really matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, everybody likes to, fish and hunt. And, so what we've always tried to do is to make sure that this remains from being one of those issues gets tagged as being a partisan issue. And so far, you look at everything from Modern Fish Act to, we have a chronic wasting disease bill we think is about to pass that has broad bipartisan support. We just passed something called the map land legislation, which is about digitizing public land access routes, especially that open up landlocked public lands, passed overwhelmingly. Even, the infrastructure bill, which had a ton of good stuff for conservation, was a bipartisan bill. So I think that what we're trying to do is, not, sort of swing back and forth depending on who's in the White House or who controls Congress, but really to try to push something we consider durable legislation that withstands the swings of political pressure. And knock on wood, we've been successful at doing that. And I think that, that's certainly our goal moving forward, because it doesn't help anybody to have, like what we're seeing with Clean Water Act, which it just genuflects back and forth depending on who's in power. And the result of that is people get away with anything they want because, there's so much limbo in the agencies, in this case, the Corps of Engineers and EPA, about what is and what is not covered, that you just get, almost no conservation happening. So we just don't want to let that happen with a lot of these other issues.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking, I'm reminded Jeff Angers of the Center for Sport Fishing Policy once told me that fishing should not be political, but the sad problem is it is political. And I tend to fall back on that when I'm thinking about these things quite a bit. So.
And listen, even in the best issue, there's going to be a 10% fringe on either side that doesn't like it. But if you can get that 80% in the middle, on board generally, great. And I'm very happy with taking the good instead of waiting for the perfect, because change is incremental.
Yep, absolutely. And it's also chronological and cultural. It takes time for the ideas to settle in and become the norm too.
Right, exactly. And all of a sudden these are working pretty well. You can build on those. And we've seen that in a variety of things. Look at the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which we're now spending more on conservation in the Farm Bill than we spend on subsidies for growers or for commodities. And that's a huge win. And I think we've just seen that increased again in the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate portion of that, because that is one thing that and that's the only thing that sucks carbon out of the air, which is things that grow and water. And so the extent that we can expand conservation and get more marginal lands out of production into conservation, that's good for climate, it's good for soil health, but it's also great for hunting and fishing, good for water quality. And so again, by building on those successes, we're able to get more every time we get along, as long as it makes sense.
So a minute ago, you mentioned the Forage Fish Conservation Act, and I said we'd come back to it. So I want to come back to it. And a year ago, you wrote a blog post about the benefits of the Forage Fish Conservation Act. And you start that off by saying, forage fish like menhaden, river herring, and shad are the foundation of the marine food web. Talk to me about the Forage Fish Act.
So there are a bunch of, as we've seen with menhaden, and menhaden is the poster child of just basically abusing the foundation of the ecosystem. And it's not just a recreational fishing issue, it's a commercial fishing issue, it's an ecosystem issue. You like whale watching, you want to make sure there are a bunch of menhaden in the water. And we have just done a terrible job of managing those bottom of the food chain species. And in the past, what we've done with menhaden and other species, to the extent that we regulated them at all, is you manage them the same way you would with a top predator commercial species. In other words, you fish them to the edge, and you make sure you're not killing so much you're going to collapse the stock, but you take every fish up to that. And what we've managed to do with menhaden in the Atlantic, at least, is move to ecosystem management, where what does the ecosystem need? And based on that, how many can you take out with an industrial fishery? Which is which then resulted in pretty significant reductions in the menhaden industry in the Atlantic. And voila, we have menhaden up and down the coast. Whales returning to 100 yards of the beaches off Long Island. Striped bass populations finally turning around. Everything is benefiting, except for a very small number of people that made a bunch of money on a public resource. And so with that same concept in mind, we wanted to make sure that there are a whole bunch of unregulated forage fish species out there that we want to get some regulation on top of before we have another crisis, before they're driven into the ground. And then, the commercial fishery just shifts to another species and drives them into the ground. So that's the whole goal of the Forage Fish Conservation Act, is to make sure that we're going to be managing any forage species under ecosystem management, and not under the old maximum sustained yield concept.
Yep, and that to me has been a very interesting issue to watch unfold, particularly as Omega shifted their base of operations, and also the recognition that with menhaden, the menhaden reduction industry is not providing, say, protein for humans, or it is an industry that's designed to provide fish meal to things like animal feed, and it's got a very different kind of focus than we tend to think of why most fisheries harvest is taking place also.
Well, listen, Cook Industries bought Omega because Cook is the largest producer of Atlantic salmon and net pen operations up in Canada, and they were in the Northwest before they got kicked out of the Northwest. So what we're doing is we're mining the bottom of the food chain here, shipping it to Canada, where they feed aquaculture salmon, which are helping put wild Atlantic salmon out of business. And then we get to import it back in, as a value-added product. We lose on this at every place you look at. But there are a handful of people that make a bunch of money.
And also in that equation, don't forget that the energy transfer is about 10% of the forage fish protein distributed through the salmon protein. So there's also a massive energy loss here in the way that protein circulates on the planet also.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk about another act, because you've been very vocal about you mentioned this a minute ago, about the Clean Water Act and the goal to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. TRCP has identified in their 3 bullet points here that 92% of sportsmen and women want the federal government to strengthen or maintain current standards for clean water protection, that 93% of hunters and anglers believe that the Clean Water Act has been a positive thing for our country, and that 4 out of 5 sportsmen and women not only support Restoring Clean Water Act, and here's the interesting part, but their commitment is firm enough that they're willing to pay more in taxes to restore or maintain our nation's water. Now, that's an odd one, because raising taxes is always the way to get a strike. Nobody wants that. So tell us about the importance of the Clean Water Act and why this kind of support is being garnered from anglers and hunters.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when the Cuyahoga River caught fire back in Ohio in the early 1970s or late 60s, whenever it was. And which was really that sort of clarion call to the nation that we had to do something about this. And the Clean Water Act has been phenomenally successful. And it is really, but primarily on the side of direct, basically source, point source discharge, namely pipes out of factories that go into rivers and sewage plants that go into the rivers. And so today we have far cleaner water. We have far better, fishing, than we did in 1972 when the act was passed. But then we get to the next area where the majority of the pollution now is not coming from point sources; it's coming from non-point sources. So in other words, it's coming off of fields, it's coming off of paved blacktops in a development. It's coming when we just don't respect the banks of a stream and take down all the trees, and all of a sudden there's erosion and everything else. And so there has been a huge amount of controversy since the mid 2000s and 2 Supreme Court rulings that basically said, hey, Congress, you need to get your act together and clarify what is and what is not included in the Clean Water Act, because now we're at the complicated stuff. I mean, the pipe into the river was pretty easy. How a farmer or how a developer interacts with a headwater stream is very different. But Congress has never dealt with the issue. So it's been left to administration after administration to define it. And the Obama administration, to their credit, went through a very long process and issued what they call the Waters of the U.S., the WOTUS rule, that outlined what was and what is not included. And what was included was headwater streams, because obviously, even if you can't, float a boat down it, those collectively, influence directly that navigable water downstream. And then adjacent wetlands. So that, basically keep the river from flooding, that, clean the water before it goes into the main river. And that's where all the controversy is. And so you had the Obama administration do Waters of the U.S., you had the Trump administration roll it back to make it even, very lax, so that only about half of the wetlands in the country would be covered and less than that of headwater streams. And so it's a classic example of why we can't afford to sort of go back and forth on this. There is a sensible, I have a lot of sympathy for some landowner or farmer or whoever that gets into trouble for inadvertently, affecting a wetland someplace. But those cases are the minority. And what we have seen is that, those little cases are held up as the example by the developers, because obviously the developer is not going to stand up there and say, hey, this is going to cost me money. They're going to put some poor slob who's, just inadvertently been screwed over by the act by a faceless bureaucrat someplace. And, it's just, we need to get past that. We need to have, I think everybody can acknowledge, especially if you look at the science, that wetlands and headwater streams are incredibly important to maintaining water quality and quantity in this country. And if you look at a place like the Gulf of Mexico and that dead zone, that comes from all this polluted runoff coming down the Mississippi River. And it's easily dealt with, but there's no incentive to deal with it right now. And because the rules are so unclear, and farmers and developers can do pretty much whatever they want and not get in trouble at this point.
That is one of the largest hypoxic zones of the 123 in the world's oceans right now also. So, yep.
And
so I do want to go ahead. I'm sorry.
And I can go back to that one. It's, the solutions are actually great for fishing and hunting too. Okay, let's put in a little bit bigger buffer strips along those streams. Let's not tile an agricultural stream and send all that water gushing into the river, which then inundates and overwhelms the infrastructures downstream. And so in particular, if you think about things like, we're going to deal with a lot more drought in the West. We need natural systems that work, that hold that water and let it infiltrate in the soil and not push it out as fast as we can get it. And, so it's tied to a lot of other issues as well.
But issues, as you suggest there, that there are solutions for. It's just a matter
Absolutely.
of.
Yeah. So. But, a lot of, it's a useful political issue on both sides. There's not a lot of incentive to, come together and come up with something very reasonable. You and I could come up with a fixed Clean Water Act tomorrow if we wanted to. But, a lot of people like having the issue more than they like having a solution.
Absolutely. I do want to let the listening crew know, too, that the TRCP web pages have a great timeline of the history of the Clean Water Act, going back to the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act through last summer's announcement by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to commit to repealing and replacing the Waters of the U.S. rule that defines which waters and wetlands should be protected under the Clean Water Act. It's a very informative timeline, and the TRCP web pages have a ton of other informative content about matters of fishing and hunting conservation. In fact, since we're talking about Forage Fish Conservation Act, I should point out that the TRCP web pages have a very informative article called Tiny Fish, Mighty Purpose, How Bait Fish Drive Sport Fishing, about the problems we're seeing with menhaden harvest and the impact of that poorly regulated harvest on sport fishing. So always check out the TRCP web pages for information about these things. Now, speaking again about the menhaden harvest, this is for my own research, and I read a lot of newsletters and other publications from within the industrial harvest industry from around the world. And one of these, the Gulf Seafood Foundation, which identifies itself as the voice of the Gulf, and this is a 501c3 nonprofit that emphasizes the importance of science and education for continued sustainable fisheries for future generations in the Gulf of Mexico. Anyway, back in 2014, in an article by the editor of Gulf Seafood News, Ed Lallo, the matter of red snapper harvest comes up, and the ongoing disagreement between the industrial harvest industry and the recreational fishing industry regarding American red snapper management and quota allocations. Could you talk about what we need to do to quell the arguments between the recreationals and the commercials in debates like the red snapper management? Is this a unsurmountable barrier between the industrial harvest and the recreational folks?
I think largely it is. And I think that allocation is the key to that. But, a lot of these allocations in these fisheries got basically locked in stone 30 years ago, really before there was a robust, saltwater recreational industry. And, so I can, if I'm a recreational angler, which I am, it's pretty easy to get ticked when you see, a quota that was set, many, many years ago, never change because, it benefits the commercial side. And so, again, I don't think you're going to get around that very much. I think it's something like menhaden. I think that, the industry claims it's all for ecosystem management. And, we'll see about that. I mean, they're going to have their scientists throwing mud at it, in every step of the way. And then you see in the Gulf of Mexico where Omega has publicly claimed that it supports ecosystem management and wants to move into it. But you see the industry refuse to accept any form of regulation down there. There's no catch limit. There are no barriers to pushing up against the beaches in Louisiana. And you're getting a more irate recreational community that eventually, our numbers will win because, there are a lot more recreational anglers than there are folks that work at the pogie plants there. But you can have both. And we're not saying eliminate, the menhaden reduction industry. We're saying make sure that the ecosystem is protected. And then if you can take some fish out on top of that, great, go for it. And industry says the right things, they support that. But in practice, and their lobbyists and their financial contributions, they try to make sure that change never happens.
Yeah, I think right there is the prime example of what we were talking about before in the difficulty of making the cultural change, of changing those ingrained concepts of how we think about the resource and about conservation. I also think that there's an interesting rhetorical issue going on there because you mentioned, they say they're in, favor of the conservation. So you look at something like the wild caught program and how they use the language of conservation, but are still engaged in the massive industrial harvest as well.
Yeah, listen, I like to eat seafood too every now and then, preferably if I catch it myself, but I'll go and buy some. So it's not like we want to shut it down, but I just think that they haven't gotten used to the fact that the recreational industry is now at least an equal player and needs to be treated as such and can't be basically, ignored or, just rolled every single time, which is the way it was done in the old days. And that's not happening anymore. And I think you're going to see a lot more conflict before you start seeing some common ground.
Well, and that's also exactly why why TRCP in particular is important, because so we've got those numbers in the recreational side of things, but unlike the commercial or industrial harvest industries, we're not cohesive. What somebody in New Jersey thinking about summer flounder is thinking about conservation is not on par with someone in the Mississippi floodplain or in California thinking about tuna. We're all over the place, and it's hard to bring 60 million anglers into line with one conservation approach.
And that was the genesis of TRCP from the beginning, because we died this death of 1,000 cuts. If it's a trout issue, then it's not a red snapper issue. If it's a mule deer issue, it's not a duck issue. And we'd sit there and watch, the community get, chipped away every place. And, Jim Range, to his credit, basically like, listen, we're not going to take scraps anymore. We're going to get together and we're going to present a united front. We're going to stick together. We may not get everything we want. We're going to get more than we've been getting. And sure enough, we happen.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the problem, of course, is there is no single galvanizing issue. I mean, the NRA can bring up, not just hunters' rights, but specifically gun rights. Rod rights aren't an issue. We don't have this one thing around which to galvanize. There are so many issues.
Yeah, but the thing that I admire the most about the NRA is that there is any attack on a gun law, any place is an attack on everybody.
Right.
For us, it's not the same. It's
right,
not
absolutely.
a mule deer issue. It's not a trout issue. It's not a red snapper issue. And it doesn't affect me personally, so I can sit on the sidelines.
Yep. And it's regional, and it's also tactic and strategy, right? Why would I care what a trout fisherman in Montana is thinking when I'm worried about clean water and in South Florida?
Right.
Very, very tough, very tough to galvanize all that. So that's why an organization like TRCP becomes so crucial. So,
well, another cool thing about the forage fish issue is it's been a chance. So I mentioned like the Marine Life Protection Act in California and some of the fights around access. This is an issue that brings everybody who cares about conservation together. So we've been working with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, with Audubon, with a variety, EDF, with others, because everybody can agree that basically mining the bottom of the food chain indiscriminately is a bad thing. And so in that sense, it's been good because it's, all of a sudden we have a lot more in common with what should be a lot of our natural allies than we have in the past.
That's great. And what a great kind of foundational issue to surround that, because then you can step off to all the other issues and say, yeah, if we're going to talk about menhaden and herring and forage fish and shad in this way, let's look at the residual problems and talk about those as well. So,
yeah, exactly. Because relationships matter. And if you've been, fighting side and side with, alongside Audubon, and all of a sudden they have a different issue on, lead and refuges or something like that, you can have a civilized discussion because those folks, we work together well, may have a different take on it, but it's not just, oh, here they go again trying to screw us.
And I think also that what you just said is also indicative of why this works as a conversation is there's the willingness to have the dialogue when so many other issues in our culture right now, the dialogue has just vanished. It's either I'm right, you're wrong, end of story. But it seems that in fisheries policy, particularly in that bipartisan approach, that we're still having some degree of dialogue.
Yep, totally agree. And I think that we're in a pretty good place right now. And I think we're going to keep getting stronger because every time you have a win, then you just have that little bit of muscle memory about what it took to do that.
That's fantastic. We've dived into some pretty heady policy matters today, and I appreciate your willingness to talk about all of this, as these are all very clearly important to anglers and hunters across the country. But I think to wrap up this a little more lightheartedly and to stick to the traditional closing question on the Rodcast, I have to ask you, what's your grail fish? What's the bucket list fish that's still out there calling you? I assume there's a fly rod involved or a striper involved. But what and where is that bucket list fish for you?
I have watched a lot of videos of giant trevally and like those hits where they go into those bays after the bait fish, which are just so cool. And I would love to go chase giant trevally at some point in shallow water.
Oh, fantastic! I'm right there with you. I want to do. I have caught one giant trevally, but it should not be called giant because it was tiny. It was probably only 2 or 3 pounds, but what a great fish to target as a quest fish. So,
yeah.
Well, Mr. Fosburgh, thank you so much, not just for this conversation, but seriously on behalf of all of us who are committed to conservation for hunting and fishing in the American great outdoors. I deeply offer my gratitude for what you've been doing. And thank you so much for joining us on the Rodcast today.
Well, Sid, thank you very much for having me on, and happy to talk again anytime.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, my listening crew, after a great conversation like that, I think it's time that we take a bourbon break. That moment in the Rodcast when we set the rod aside, put our feet up and contemplate those fine spirits that just make the fishing life even better than it already is. And on today's bourbon break, I want to take a big swig or two from Slaughterhouse American whiskey. Now, this is an interesting whiskey to consider because it has its origins in wine. That's right, Slaughterhouse American whiskey is the brainchild of David Phinney, who founded Orion Swift Cellars, through which he began to produce the Prisoner line of wines back in 2000. This is a popular line of wines which can be found on supermarket shelves across the country. Phinney sold his wine company and decided to turn to whiskey making, but he never really let go of his wine heritage, aging his whiskey in used wine barrels as part of the finishing process. Now, what that means is that after aging the whiskey in charred oak barrels, the whiskey is transferred to finishing barrels to add a new flavor to the whiskey. Now, this isn't a new thing, using wine barrels and port barrels to finish scotch. That's been done for a long time, and we're starting to see more and more American whiskeys and bourbons using this process as well. Now, the Slaughterhouse American whiskey carries a heavy corn mash bill of 85% corn, 8% wheat, 6% rye, and 1% malted barley. So you can anticipate that this is going to be a sweet whiskey with all that corn. Now, the American Slaughterhouse whiskey is aged for 9 years in American oak, and then the whiskey is transferred to French oak barrels that had been used to age Napa Valley Bordeaux and other red wines. This finishing adds to the sweetness and the floral aspects of the whiskey. After the finishing, they then, and this is a quote, they quote, tame the whiskey with pristine wine country water. Now, the label of the Slaughterhouse American whiskey, a name that evokes a slew of campy horror films, including the great Slaughterhouse Rules from 2018, featuring the amazing Simon Pegg. Well, the Slaughterhouse American whiskey label has a very elegant look to it, and it features a label with what looks like an antique photograph or a daguerreotype of a butcher knife, which is kind of conjuring up that creepy Gothic vibe. However, I can't find any indication as to why they named the whiskey Slaughterhouse. So there's no story out there, which seems to me not only to be dull in terms of establishing the whiskey's ethos, but also just bad marketing. Likewise, the bottle itself, though it's nothing unique. It's a design you'll see used by many distillers. It's best described as generic. Now, the nose of this 4-grain whiskey is anticipated because of that heavy corn mash bill. It's sweet and aromatic. There's a lot of popcorn here from the corn, but also a lot of caramel and the sweetness of stewing fruits like prunes and raisins with a touch of toastiness from the oak. The Bordeaux is also evident with airs of that floral scent that I mentioned earlier. That sweetness, that dominates the palate as well, with lots of floral layers and fruit layers from that wine finish blended into the sweetness of caramel and honey accents of the corn-heavy whiskey. It's a rich palate with a good weight to it, but it seems expected, nothing unique in the palate that sets it apart from a dozen other whiskeys out there. It's also a lower proof whiskey at 88 proof, which I assume that water taming that they talk about, that water dilutes down a bit. And as such, there's not much alcohol glow in the palate and not much in the way of a strong spice in the taste either. The finish just doesn't hang around long, and there's not really any shift in the taste spectrum at the end. Just more sweet, more corn, more Bordeaux-inspired fruitiness. All in all, there's nothing wrong with the Slaughterhouse American whiskey, but there's nothing particularly arousing about it either. I guess if David Phinney was okay having his wine become popular on supermarket shelves, that he's achieved a similar mediocrity in his whiskey, which should be at home on the lower shelves in the liquor store, except for the fact that for a humdrum whiskey, it's a bit overpriced at about $40 to $45 a bottle, a price tag that might encourage some ill-informed stock boy to put the Slaughterhouse a from where its quality might otherwise place it. So I am neither a fan nor not a fan of the Slaughterhouse American whiskey. It's a mid-road whiskey, the kind of whiskey that might find a home at Olive Garden rather than at a good cigar bar. And those are my thoughts about Slaughterhouse American whiskey. Hey, and as a final note in my regular disclaimer, as always, please keep in mind that the Fishing Professor Bourbon Break reviews, well, they ain't sponsored. The distillers haven't sent me samples, nor do they influence my reviews at all. Though, as always, I am open to sponsorship, bribery, and extortion. The bourbons I review are purchased out of pocket, and my reviews are based on the keen sense of bourbon know-how that I have developed over many years, probably too many years, in many of this country's finest watering holes, drinking establishments, dives, pubs, honky-tonks, and back alley speakeasies. Hey, speaking of, let me give a quick shout out to the No Name Pub on Big Pine Key, one of the best drinking atmosphere in all of Florida's Keys, and certainly one of the best casual dining experiences in the Keys. But you got to find it to enjoy it, because it's a bit off the beaten path on Watson Boulevard. And let me just say that if you are a pizza fan, you have to try the No Name Pub's amazing pizza. I cannot tell you how many times that pizza has elevated my spirits after a day on the water or a day of Keys-style drinking. The No Name Pub is an angler's establishment, and the crowd is always populated with anglers from all over the lower Keys. Man, how I wish I were there right now. But I wish I were drinking and fishing in the Keys every day, or I wish that every day, something like that. And as a final word, I hope that today will be the least happy of your remaining days. As always, if you have comments about this week's Bourbon Break, feel free to email me at sid@inventivefishing.com. So let's tie one on and get back to casting.
Project command. Stand by power transfer. Time is X minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
And yes, indeed, Project Command has it right. It is time for this week's top 10 list. And this week, my mind has been on king mackerel because, well, I really like fishing for kings. I used to run clothespin rigs from the piers for kings, and I love casting to kings behind the shrimp boats. And of course, live baiting and drift fishing for kings is an absolute blast, as is trolling for them or casting to them. Now, I could certainly talk about using different stinger rigs for kings with live bait, or churning them up with pilchards or other bait fish as chum, but there's not a lot to count down there. How do you count down those real smoker moments, or those fantastic aerial strikes, or the numbers of poor little greenies you pitch out there to chum the big boy smokers to the line? But we can count down my top 10 lures for targeting mackerels, and that's what we're going to do. So let's do just that. At number 10, let's open the day with C&H's King Buster. Now, really, the King Buster isn't a lure qua lure. It's a bullet-headed skirt made with a chrome-plated head that you rig strip bait, live bait, cigar minnows, or whatever with. But for whatever reason, the additional visual flair of the silver bullet head and the skirt, and I like the black and purple, by the way, well, that added flair to a bait just increases the likelihood of a king strike. I also like that C&H sells them in 100 packs or as singles, because let's face it, a king strike is basically the same thing as a torpedo with razored teeth plowing into your lure or your bait. And if you're fishing kings a lot, you're going to need and want a lot more than one or two of these around. All right. At number 9, let's go classic with Sea Striker's Cedar Plug. Now, I know that the Sea Striker Cedar Plugs are a mainstay among tuna anglers, as well as striper and bluefish anglers, but they're also fantastic for kings. I mean, let's be realistic. There's nothing pretentious or technologically advanced about the Sea Striker Cedar Plug. It's a tried and true lure that works well when trolling, either up close in the wash or further out in your spread, or they work great as a casting plug too. Just a hands down, iconic, dependable lure that kings will ruthlessly slam. I'm a fan of the blue and white sparkle color pattern, but the others are great just as well. All right, at number 8, like my shout out to C&H's King Buster at number 10, I also like the No Alibi trolling feathers, which, like the King Buster, you can rig skirt style with a strip bait or a live bait, or you can simply rig them as a trolling lure. I love the solid head on these lures, and they are effective at a range of trolling speeds. Hey, and as a side note, if you're trolling for kings instead of drifting for them, the ideal trolling speeds, from my experience, are to run your spread at 7 to 10 knots. So a bit of a faster speed, but not too fast like you would for who or something like that. And with the No Alibi trolling feathers, I like the black and purple again for kings, but blues and whites work well too. And number 7, let's go with Almost Alive Lures ribbon fish. Now, kings love, love, love ribbon fish. And the Almost Alive ribbon fish is a damn good ribbon fish imitator. This is a durable rubber lure that is available in a 12-inch version and a 17.5-inch version. They only come in about 6 color patterns, but I'm a fan of the black and silver. These come rigged or unrigged. All right, at number 6, let's stick with the ribbon fish imitators and give a shout out to the Williamson Alive ribbon fish, a fantastic king lure. The Williamson ribbon fish features a great through lure wire that is rigged with triple treble hooks to help secure and hold the king strike. Now, I will say I'm not 100% sure that the Williamson is still making the ribbon fish, though they appear in catalogs in a few stores. They no longer appear in the Williamson site on the Rapala webpage. Nonetheless, if you can find them, they are top-tier king lures. Okay, bringing us to the halfway point. Let's go with Daiwa's Saltiga SK jigs. And while I've thrown some trolling lures in the list so far, the Saltiga SK is a slow jigging metal lure that is great when you have kings around a wreck or a reef. The falling spinning action of the Saltiga SK is a great action for attracting a king strike. It can also be used as a cast and reel jig. I like it as a faster retrieve when you're fishing it this way. The dual single hooks are also great for grabbing into the king's toothy bite on a strike. All in all, the Saltiga SK is just a great lure to have around when kings are around. At number 4, how about the classic, dependable Rapala Countdown Magnum? This may be one of the best saltwater lures ever made, and it certainly finds its application across a wide range of species, and among them is certainly the king mackerel. The Rapala Countdown Magnum is tough. Its saltwater grade hardware and its African Abachi wood body can really stand up to the king strikes. There are 4 models of the Countdown Magnum, ranging from a 4 3/8-inch version to a 9-inch version. Each of these runs at a different depth, ranging from a version that runs at 13 to 15 feet down to a version that runs at 18 to 25 feet, giving you the ability to run the lure at a depth where the kings are patrolling. All right, at number 3, let's go with Yozuri's Bonita lure, a truly great high-speed trolling lure. I love the strength of this lure. Its solid body design wobbles in great action no matter how fast you run it. Its double flat forged stainless steel hooks are affixed to the lure with stainless steel bearing swivels that allow the hooks to run freely with reduced opportunity to tangle. As I said, these are great high-speed trolling lures, and they really do their best at speeds of about 6 to 15 knots. They come in 2 sizes, a smaller 6 3/4-inch version and an 8 1/4-inch version, and they're available in 6 different color patterns. Okay, coming in at the runner-up position, I want to go with a tried and true king lure, and that's Mirror Lure's Drone Spoon. Now, drone spoons are fantastic trolling lures for so many species, and when paired with a planer, you can run them at any depth. The flash and wobble of drone spoons make them an ideal king attracting lure. Mirror Lure's original drone spoons are made of solid, high-polished stainless steel that is incredibly corrosion resistant. There is no plating on these lures to corrode, to chip, to peel. They use strong, reliable hooks, and the rigging rings are solid nickel silver and are hand silver soldered for really tough strength. They range in size from 1/2-inch models up to 4.5-inch versions. And while the plain silver versions are great, I like the versions with the silver or green reflective tape on the exterior of the spoon. Just an all around reliable king lure. All right, that brings us to my favorite lure for targeting king mackerel. But before I share that wisdom with you, let me get a quick recap in case there's a quiz later. At number 10 is C&H's King Buster. At number 9, Sea Striker's Cedar Plug. At number 8, No Alibi's Trolling Feathers. At number 7, Almost Alive Lures Ribbon Fish. At 6, Williamson Alive Ribbon Fish. At 5, Daiwa Saltiga SK Jigs. At 4, Rapala's Countdown Magnum. At 3, Yozuri's Bonita. And at number 2, Mirror Lure Drone Spoon. And that brings me to my number 1 lure for targeting king mackerels. And frankly, there's not much difference between my number 1 and my number 2 in this list, because while number 2 was Mirror Lure's Drone Spoon, my number 1 is the LB Huntington Drone Spoon. And the only reason I'm placing the Huntington Drone at number 1 and the Mirror Lure Drone at number 2 is that hunting was the original drone spoon and that I started fishing them before I started fishing the mirror lure drones. But here's the reality of it. The mirror lure and the Huntington's drones, they're the same spoons with the same descriptions and the same effectiveness. There are two versions of the Huntington drone, the original and the Eco Lure. The original drone spoons are made of solid, highly polished stainless steel that is corrosion resistant. There's no plating to corrode, to chip, or peel, as I said about the mirror lure also. The replaceable hooks are of the highest quality forged Mustad O'Shaughnessy patterns with filed hollow points and Duratin plated, all the hooks. Huntington guarantees the hooks against breakage, and they use solid nickel silver rings, which are hand silver soldered for the greatest strength of the rigging eye. They're available in sizes 0 to 4.5 and are available in 18 powder-coated colors with or without one of the 15 flash scale colors to add to. So we can really combine the number 1 and the number 2 in this week's list and just say drone spoons, because whether it's mirror lures iteration or Huntington's iteration, they're all the same spoon, and these are just fantastic lures for kings. And that wraps up the Professor's Top 10 King Mackerel Lures for this week. As usual, if you want to let me know your thoughts about this week's Top 10, if you have king lures you think I should be looking at, or if you're a manufacturer or you want to alert me to your lure, just send me an email at sid@inventivefishing.com. And as always, if you'd like a Fishing Professor's Top 10 about a particular fishing related thing, just send me an email and I'll see about adding it to my list for future Top 10s. And that's it for this week's Top 10. Let's get back to casting. And here we are once again at the end of the line, at the end of another episode of the Fishing Professor Rodcast. I hope you had as much fun listening to me ramble as I did in doing the rambling. Ramble on, Rose. Did you say your name was Ramblin' Rose? Ramble on, baby. Settle down easy. Ramble on, Rose. Hey, before we turn out the lights on this one, I do want to thank Whit Fosburgh of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership for taking the time to talk with me today on the Rodcast. And I do want to thank him for all that he and everyone at TRCP does to help protect our accesses to the places where we fish and where we hunt. Hey, I do hope you enjoyed my review of Slaughterhouse American whiskey, and I hope that my countdown of my top 10 lures for targeting kingfish was as useful as I thought it was. Hey, before I sign off today, I do have a message for our brothers and sisters out there behind the line. Go to Channel 9. I say again, go to Channel 9. And that just about does it for this week's episode of the Fishing Professor Rodcast. Be sure to look for next week's episode, which will drop on Wednesday next week, as it does every week. And I hope you and all the members of my listening crew will be spreading the word about the Rodcast. And of course, if you have a comment or question about anything on this week's show, or have recommendations for future top 10s, bourbon breaks, interviews, or information about specific fishing related issues, please feel free to email me at sid@inventivefishing.com, or leave a reply in any of the comment sections on any of the podcast platforms you use to listen to the Rodcast. Hey, be sure to follow Inventive Fishing on Twitter, Instagram, and friend us on Facebook at Inventive Fishing. And be sure to check out all the great video content over on the Inventive Fishing YouTube channel, which includes great gear reviews, new product introductions, and a whole bunch of other content. Hey, I will be back next week with another episode. Until then, this is Sid Dobrin, the Fishing Professor. Fish on.
The Fishing Professor Show is copyrighted by Inventive Fishing, LLC. Any rebroadcast of the podcast without the consent from Inventive Fishing, LLC is strictly prohibited. Fish on!